going to be presenting my research topic on the effectiveness of youth diversion as a deterrent model for youth delinquency. So starting off today, I've provided a bit of an agenda. So we're going to be starting off with background and the importance of youth diversion programming, and then moving into the school to prison pipeline. Then following that, youth delinquency and parental relations, and how deterrence, diversion, prevention, and addressing recidivism can influence diverse approaches to juvenile diversion, and ending us off with policy implications and our conclusion. So starting us off with background and the importance of youth diversion programming, typically we see as of 2023 that 80% of youth will reoffend within their first 5 years of arrest. This is important to note because traditional punitive approaches such as arresting raise significant concerns for the developmental vulnerabilities that youth will typically face and how long-term harm is associated with incarceration. Typically within the criminal justice system, both male and female identifying individuals will experience mistreatment, which makes it critical that us as a community and as a society implement protective factors that are strategized and empirically based in order to minimize the risk of offending. These protective factors in regards to youth diversion programming typically involve things such as job searching, graduation pathways, community resources, and stable living environments. So this leads us into the school to prison pipeline, where typically the first encounter of criminal justice system may or may not occur. Suspensions, expulsions, and resource officers usually can put youth at risk because this creates an environment of hostility and also reinforces zero tolerance policies, which have been shown to be ineffective in terms of addressing youth discipline. When youth are disciplined in this way of suspensions, expulsions, and overusing resource officers, it weakens social bonds because it places this emphasis of them being problematic, and it pushes them out of an academic environment or an educational environment and rather makes them feel as though they are at risk. So while school may be a big underlying factor, not only may they experience these kinds of risks at school, they may also be experiencing that home, which is also a critical reason why youth diversion programming is an important role in the success and resources that children may be receiving. And this is because a child's environment serves as a pivotal moment of whether the child may or may not offend, especially if a child is developing weaker social bonds, which typically will create a lack of emotional stability and guidance. This is especially true if the parent is involved in the criminal justice system, whether that's currently or previously involved. And the goal is to kind of stop the risk associated with intergenerational criminal involvement. This is why a lot of youth diversion programming places an emphasis on family-focused and effective mechanisms that are used to reduce recidivism in reference to parents so that it doesn't follow along with the child. So they have the potential youth diversion programming to kind of counter the risks that come with intergenerational incarceration. And it usually helps when the program highlights family engagement and rehabilitation. So leading into deterrence, diversion, and prevention and why these components matter in regards to youth diversion programming, this usually shows us deterrence as a threat of punishment. It doesn't typically need to be a threat of punishment, but it shows us that with a threat of punishment that it could deter a child from engaging in criminal involvement, regardless of whether or not they have been involved before. Diversion is a form of redirecting youth, so the child doesn't necessarily have to had been in the criminal justice system. Typically they are. So it's just another form of showing them kind of how to prevent any future offending. And then this leads us into prevention, which allows us to identify the root causes of offending and recidivism that can allow us to develop effective long-term success and resources for youth. While all of these are different in terms of definition, they all reinforce one another in terms of creating a multi-layered protective approach with youth. Um, and all of these identify programming components that not only influence constructive accountability, but they also do things such as housing stability, family supports, community based resources. It allows them to address the risk in its entirety and identify long term vulnerability of youth. So, identifying how deterrence and prevention and diversion coincide with each other can allow us to understand how in the future and currently we can reduce juvenile delinquency. Um, Juvenile delinquency is important to address because we need to, in order to address delinquency, after the fact, we need to address the recidivism as rearrest may or may not continue. Um, as previously mentioned, repeated offending can reinforce deeper developmental, environmental, social, and systemic challenges. Um, if there's forms of instability, it can infiltrate every other area of their lives, which developmental, environmental, social, you name it. Recidivism has the power to do that, unfortunately. And of course, youth diversion programming's goal is to kind of combat that. Um, so, contact with the system has a way of doing so. And the goal is to improve youth outcomes in order to ensure community safety and provide the necessary support for juvenile success. So, understanding how recidivism perpetuates a deeper cycle of involvement in the criminal justice system. And typically, when addressing recidivism, it's important to identify building skills, repairing previous harm, and strengthening these protective factors without instilling fear, which we have stated previously has found to be ineffective. So when we've addressed recidivism, it's important to identify diverse approaches to juvenile diversion. It's not typically that one shoe fits all. Not all empirical studies have said that one main thing is the holy grail in terms of how we address juvenile diversion. And there have been practices that have proven to be effective, but it's not, it's more than one. In this presentation, I've identified three, which is restorative diversion programming, mental health and substance use intervention programming, and lastly, juvenile boot camps. In terms of restorative diversion programming, this typically involves the victim and the offender and how they choose to work together in order to build a stronger outcome and leave harm that may have been done to the victim in the past. So, allowing the offender to understand their sense of victimization and the victim themselves and moving forward past that. And not only doing so, but underlying the causes of their behavior and addressing it at the same time. Usually, this has been a significant tool for racialized youth who have become disproportionately subjected to punitive school discipline and juvenile justice involvement, which I previously mentioned in another slide from the school to prison pipeline. So that's typically where that one goes. The second one is mental health and substance use intervention programming. This allows us to identify that there are youth within our programs that suffer mental illness and need extra support. The last one is juvenile boot camps. This is typically a boot camp that is more strong, regimented routines, physical conditioning, and a more militaristic style of conditioning. Not one is found to be more effective, but they all have found to have some form of effectiveness. So to end off my presentation, policy implications have shown that restorative and treatment-oriented diversion pathways for youth have found to be extremely effective. Building a community-based, trauma-informed counseling framework has found to be extremely effective. We also need to fund these forms of diversion models, especially family therapy, because we want to take a preventative approach to the intergenerational impacts of incarceration. Overall, youth diversion plays a significant role in the reduction of recidivism and improving youth outcomes. These are my references, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.